Hi, my name is Haley. I'm going to be explaining colorblind racism, and I'll explain the background and the theories surrounding it. To begin, what is colorblind racism? Our original understanding of the term racism is that one race believes it is superior or better than all others. This is where we see very obvious blatant racism. That includes Jim Crow segregation and slavery. However, today, modern racism has evolved and is much more subtle. The subtle racism is called colorblind racism. According to Benilla Silva, colorblind racism can also be called laissez-faire racism, competitive racism, and symbolic racism. But essentially, it is racism where racial matters, the majority race creates raceless explanations to explain why things are not equal. So an example of this would be schooling. In the Benilla Silva article, the author argues that school segregation in a post-racial nation is explained by whites as being a matter of choice. People can send their kids wherever they want. A common colorblind racist phrase that someone would use to describe this would be, quote, "People should send their kids to the school they choose." Since colorblind racism is so difficult to see and understand because it's so subtle, it can be especially damaging in societies to non-white individuals. In Peggy McIntosh's Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege, she delves into white privileges that whites don't realize that they have, and that whites don't realize that other races don't have. She wrote a list that explains some of these privileges. One that caught my eye was number 25, that says, quote, "If a traffic cop pulls me over, or if the IRS audits my tax returns, I can be sure I haven't been signaled out because of my race." This is a privilege that many whites don't realize they have. This privilege could easily be used in a colorblind racist way. For instance, someone could argue that the reason a person was picked by police or by the IRS for an audit was not because of their race, but something simple, like they were driving poorly, or there was a mistake on their taxes, which is why they were chosen. When we look at the arguments that way, we can see how deceptive that colorblind mode of thinking is, and how harmful that can be, since racism is never the culprit, but is always a secondary issue. The studies have pointed to systematic and institutional racism as having a great impact on colorblind racism, and allowing it to continue throughout our history. In the Chapman article, the author argues that there are starting points in history that allowed the creation of the system that privileges whites. Some examples were, quote, slavery, manifest destiny, and the westward expansion. Chapman further argues that, quote, U.S. society was built upon the maintenance of white supremacy and the oppression of people of color. Furthermore, in the Fury article, this idea is continued. The author states that whites in a society have a mindset that the marginalized are outsiders, who are lazy and incompetent. This is a racist mindset that whites have, which is to encourage these quote-unquote outsiders to succeed or survive. It echoes the idea of a white man's burden. However, Fear points out in the article something they call the structure. They explain that we live in a structure and we all live together in this one structure. There are no insiders or outsiders. The author further explains that whites need to try to change this racist mindset, and we need to realize that we are not separated. We need to all work together to change the structure or systematic racism that affects non-white groups today. Otherwise, nothing will change, and it's a team effort. So, in part 2, I will go into specific ways we can combat colorblind racism in America, and how it can be challenged in different areas of life, such as education. Here is my work cited, and thanks for listening.